everyone, I'm Captain Logan. Welcome back to the bunker. Today I'm going to do a little spoiler cast for the first part of Flash Season 6. And I am primarily doing this because of some requests I got after I did the spoiler cast on the first part of the season of Arrow leading up to Crisis. And I should mention that at the point that this video is posting, the first part of Crisis has already come out, and I've not seen it yet because I'm recording this just after it airs, and I'll be watching it tomorrow. My plan with Crisis is I'm going to review the first 3 episodes after they air. They're airing each day for the next 3 days. The last one is on Tuesday, and there's going to be a gap. There's going to be a cliffhanger, and then it's going to come back on January 14th, 15th, and that day, they're going to do the last 2 episodes on the same day. So I'm going to do that in 2 videos because with the sheer number of characters that are going to be in that, I'm assuming that it's going to be dense enough, there's going to be lots of stuff to talk about, or at least stuff to geek out about, and so I'm going to talk about that in 2 different videos. I'm really excited about it, and a lot more excited than I thought I would be. Man, Flash and Arrow both so much better this season than I've seen them in a long time. Maybe part of it is just being out of the loop and kind of missing these shows to some degree, regardless of how frustrated I got with them. I mean, if I had come back and they were just unwatchable like sometimes they had been before, if they were as convoluted and contrived as they had been, I probably wouldn't have been compelled to watch them. I think they really are better than they had been, but I want to put all cards on the table and make sure everybody knows like my limitations right now talking about these shows. I'm not the most qualified person to weigh in right now because I've not watched every episode of all these shows now. At one time, I kept up with these religiously, and I got to the point where I just didn't want to talk about it, just didn't want to watch them anymore. And I've not seen the last 2 to 2.5 seasons of Flash, so like I'm very behind and out of the loop on this show. I had no idea what the status quo was like, and Arrow, at least, I had gone ahead and watched 6 a while back and talked about that, and 7 I'd watched the first couple episodes of, but haven't finished yet. I went ahead and just skipped ahead to 8 so that I had a sense of the status quo for the show that I was told was much more important to watch than any of the others leading up to Crisis, kind of a Crisis prologue dealing with Oliver being told by the Monitor that he was going to die in Crisis and there was nothing he could do about it. And hey, guess what? Flash has exactly the same thing, and except it feels even a little bit more dire about it. I think partly because it's supposed to play as, and I think it does, a little more tragic that the more positive and altruistic and optimistic of the 2 heroes who doesn't go around and kill people as much and isn't constantly trying to weigh the ends and the means about killing people, that guy dying is a lot sadder, is a lot more tragic. He's a little younger than Oliver Queen is. He has still, even 6 seasons in, a little bit more of a boyish quality to him. He still feels like a kid to some degree. This is a guy with all of his life ahead of him despite everything he's been through, and he doesn't deserve to die. And Oliver is, of course, a much darker, a much more brooding and guilty character. He's got a lot of stuff that he still is atoning for, and that guy was never gonna live to a ripe old age. And Flash certainly doesn't have that, at least nearly as much, and so it's supposed to play as a lot sadder and a lot more tragic. It's easy, I think, to look at each of these shows and say that both characters are going through the same character arc, that they're telling effectively the same story on both ends, and I'm going to have to wait until we see how it all plays out with Crisis before I can say how much of a problem having, or if it is at all, doing a oh no, I'm going to die, I wish I could change the future, but I can't story with both of these characters. If that's a problem at all, and how much of a problem it is. Because on the one end, again, you could say, well, God, I'm already doing that with Oliver. Can't we just have one major character that may or may not die in Crisis, and watch Crisis and see how that plays out, and not have to constantly lead up to it, not keep talking about it, and not do constant try to stop the bad future plot, knowing what the future is, or just saying, oh, well, we can't, but we have to keep, wallowing about it. It's laid on pretty thick in Flash, and there are places where it's truly dramatic and kind of heart-wrenching and sad. I really like the scene at the end of episode 8 The Last Temptation of Barry Allen Part 2, the episode right before Crisis is going to start, where all of our friends and allies are sitting in one room, like watching Barry and talking to him and trying not to just have a really sad, silent room. It's a really somber scene, and it feels like everybody in a room, like just after they found out that their loved one has cancer, or knowing that he's dead. It's like watching Barry on his deathbed. I really like that scene. But anyway, so like on the one hand, both characters are going through the same thing. On the other hand, there's kind of some interesting parallels between them, and the shows are playing it a little bit differently. So with Oliver, it's a lot more, he's going to die, there's nothing he can do about it. He does have a big part to play in Crisis, but it doesn't feel as big as in Flash, and Oliver accepts it much more readily. Like, Barry Allen clearly doesn't want to die, and I'm not saying Oliver does, but I think there's almost a sense of relief with him a little bit. And it's hard not to read that cynically from where I'm sitting as, yeah, Oliver's just really sick of going through the same character arc over and over again and constantly being regressed. So he's ready to be put out of his misery, just like I sometimes am as well. It also really feels like one of these actors wants to keep going and the other one doesn't. And I don't know how true that is, but Stephen Amell certainly looks ready to be done with this universe, done with this character, move on to other things, to greener pastures. And it feels like Grant Gustin is still really enjoying his show and maybe finding a second wind in a way. I feel like both Gustin and the show have an energy that I've not seen since the first couple seasons, and it is a lot more fun to watch. It's a lot more entertaining, and it's a lot tighter of a narrative. So I should also mention that even though both shows are dealing with mortality in a really similar way, and both of them know that they're going to die, they're very, very different shows. Not just tonally, of course, and sometimes they're very tonally similar because they have really similar comedic sensibilities, even though one is a darker-looking show than the other one, you know, some of the time. There's still a lot of horror-type stuff in Flash. We've got a whole zombie two-parter this season, but they're structured really differently. Like, Flash is a lot more of one ongoing narrative. Like, it is episode to episode. There is a story being told in each episode, but much less so than in Arrow. Arrow is a lot more episodic in that each episode is, like somebody mentioned in the comments on the Arrow video I did last week, each of those episodes is supposed to kind of represent another season or a major element from that show. And of course, Flash, as far as we know, isn't ending this season, and you know, this isn't a going out season. So importantly, part of the reason that Arrow is doing that is because, like I said in that video, it's playing its greatest hits a little bit, and it's kind of a reunion season, and Flash is not doing that. Flash is actually charting new ground a little bit, which I really appreciate. It has a solid and pretty compelling, especially for these shows, villain that's doing something that we haven't really seen before, and that doesn't have a big, giant, convoluted master manipulation plot, where he just does a bunch of stuff, and then retroactively we say, see, he knew exactly where everything was going, and he manipulated everybody. He was 25 steps ahead. This is not that. This is a guy who doesn't start off as a villain at all, who has a very tragic Jekyll Hyde thing. The villain turns into Bloodwork, and he's played by the guy who played Mohinder in Heroes, and he's great. A little typecast, because he is playing another scientist, and he's playing another guy who ends up injecting himself with a serum that gives him superpowers, but it ends up being more of a curse than a blessing, and he screws up and he turns himself into a monster. That's exactly what Mohinder does in, I think, the third season of Heroes, second or third season of Heroes. It's when they do the whole kind of heroes villains switch thing in that, and so some of the heroes end up becoming villains, but a lot of them get turned around again later, like Mohinder. He gives a fantastic performance this season. I like him every time he's on screen. There are places, of course, where he gets real over the top, super comic book villain, but there's also some charm to that. That's also kind of fun, and I think it's earned more than it is sometimes, even though there's some other irritating melodrama in this show. Some of the relationship stuff, as often with these shows, is just laid on too thick, and you've got characters kind of talking too much in emotional platitudes, like I've talked about ad nauseum with these shows. Part of the reason I stopped reviewing these regularly is I felt like I was just throwing the same criticisms at them week after week after week, and so some of that stuff is still there, but there's an energy and a charm to it that's kind of come back. And anyway, that villain I think is really interesting. I like dealing with a guy who is obsessed with immortality this season, where Barry knows that he's supposed to die in Crisis and doesn't think there's anything he can do about it. And this guy talks about Barry like he has a terminal illness, just like he does. So this guy, Ramsey, he's got this cancer called HLH, and his mother died of it, and he resents his mother for not fighting harder and for embracing her death. There's a lot of talk this season about when you know you're gonna die, and some of this is actually kind of thoughtful, and I really appreciate it, that this is the question: when you know you're going to die, when is it giving up to give in and allow that to happen, and when is it heroic? And so there's a lot of talk early on this season about whether or not Barry should keep fighting to live, even though he knows that he can't. There's nothing he can do about it. And, is it denial for him to fight it, or is it just being realistic and facing the inevitable, and then going out in the best way he can by saving the universe, the multiverse? And this Ramsey guy doesn't believe in that. He thinks that if you're not doing everything you can to survive, that you're a coward, period. And again, he to some degree kind of hates his mother for doing that, and he thinks that Barry is out to lunch for allowing that to happen. And of course, he doesn't know initially that Barry is the Flash, so he's talking about Barry like he has a uncurable illness, because he actually an incurable illness. Excuse me, because he thinks that's what it is. Because I think it's a little silly, but like he just kind of looks in his eyes and can tell, oh, you have the same look that my mother did when she knew she was terminally ill. And I don't know, that's a little bit easy. That's a little bit like Robin John Blake, where he looks into Bruce Wayne's eyes and he can immediately tell that he's Batman. But it's a good metaphor for a terminal illness. I mean, at the same time, we're doing an actual terminal illness, but I do like that metaphor, and I like exploring what having a terminal illness is like, and how you spend your final days, and how a person would want to go out, and again, what is heroic and what is cowardly. And eventually, of course, Ramsey gets totally out to lunch and completely loses himself after he gets to a point of no return, when he's developed this cure that turns him into a life-craving monster, where he basically has to kill people in order to survive, and he keeps trying to validate it by saying that it's all about trying to save everyone and keep everyone alive, but in order to do that, he also has to feed on people and murder them. So he basically becomes a vampire. He becomes like Spider-Man 3 Venom with his mask off, looking like vampire. And eventually he ends up creating a whole bunch of zombies, including Barry Allen. And the way that whole thing is handled is a little silly. It's a little cheesy. There's a whole episode, and I find these somewhat tedious. This is done better than some, but it's a little tedious, where he has to go on kind of a vision quest, talking to the literal personification, at least in his mind, of the Speed Force, which I guess we've done before, but I either haven't seen that in the series or didn't remember it. And the Speed Force, of course, comes to him as his mother, and tells him that he has to fight Ramsey, but that there's nothing he can do still to save himself from the crisis, or rather that actually there is, but because he is so important to Crisis, he needs to bite the bullet and take one for the team. And Barry, of course, says that he's tired of constantly having to take one for the team. And I like the way Grant Gustin acts this scene, where he gets really desperate and he kind of loses himself a little bit. And he says, I always have to suffer. When is it your turn to suffer? Personification of the Speed Force. So there's stuff in that I like, but it's a little stretched out. I'm not even sure that needed to be 2 episodes, to be perfectly honest with you. But again, there's some nice stuff in there. So I'm interested in Ramsey. He remains as sympathetic of a villain as I guess he can once he gets into monster mode, and he's able to control his form so he can keep going back and looking human, and then go to looking like a monster, and then he can actually like do a make my monster grow and turn into like this big giant vicious huge monster, and it kind of like a red abomination. And I don't know what that character looks like in the comics because I've not read him before, so I imagine he probably is a big giant blob creature, but I have no idea because I've not looked at it, and I don't know if this background is anything like it is in that. But you know who he reminds me a little bit of? He reminds me a little bit of, I mean, it's not the same thing, but a little bit of Sam Witwer's Doomsday in Smallville Season 8, just in that he's a perfectly likable guy who's trying to do the right thing, and something horrible happens to him and he just kind of loses himself. And it's it's a really nice change of pace from our standard just I want to rule the whole universe kind of character. So we have, of course, a larger looming threat in the background, which is Crisis, and I like that while we're kind of waiting for that to happen, and it's this big, scary, looming threat, we've got this relatively smaller threat where the stakes are still big enough, but not insane. And it's almost like, and I don't know what the last 2 seasons did exactly, but it's almost like we needed to know that we have the biggest possible insane thing you could imagine about to happen before we really reined it in a little bit and told more of a real story. Now, I will say I'm not sure that Ramsey ultimately has legs for an entire season. I feel like he could have been taken out at the end of this and been good, and I'm pretty sure he's probably going to break out and we're going to keep dealing with him. Maybe not, but the sense I get is that he is still this season big bad, and once we come back after Crisis, we will continue dealing with him. Let me step back for a minute before I talk about any other characters and subplots and say that there's been, of course, a whole lot of speculation about whether the series is continuing and whether Barry Allen will actually die in Crisis. And I want to talk about my theories and what I think is probably going to happen. First of all, this show is almost certainly not getting canceled because, and I keep hearing people say, like, isn't Flash ending? And I did a little bit of research on this, and everything I can find is that there's nothing confirmed about that, but we did confirm that Arrow is ending, and Flash has continued to have pretty solid ratings compared to everything else in the CW. So it seems really unlikely that that's getting canceled. I don't know why they wouldn't have announced it already, because it wouldn't be a cancellation, it would be an ender. And if we're making a big deal out of Barry Allen having to die just like Oliver, why wouldn't we say, oh, and the series is ending? And in a way, Arrow is actually not getting canceled. Like, it is. There is going to be a new spin-off show, but it has Green Arrow in the title. Again, I think, the last time I looked this up, that show was called Green Arrow and the Canaries, and not just the Canaries. And apparently that Green Arrow is supposed to be Oliver's daughter, which is going to be maybe unfortunate because I don't think that actress can act her way out of a paper bag. If that is indeed who is supposed to like hold the reins of that show. But I guess we'll see how that works out. Anyway, so we're still going to have kind of Arrow and Flash on at the same time, assuming that Flash is coming back. So one of 2 things is, of course, I just did this. I meant 2. One of 2 things is, of course, going to happen. Either Barry Allen gets replaced with some other Flash, or he doesn't actually die in Crisis. And I think either of those things is actually possible. I guess there's a third option, which is somebody else takes over for Flash for a while. so that it doesn't feel like all of this lead up was for nothing. Because I keep thinking it would kind of suck if you came back from the break with Crisis and Barry just comes back like business as usual, even though he was told he was going to die. And then you're like, oh, we spent a whole lot of time mourning him before he was even dead, and with like everyone having to have a big, lengthy, sad conversation about how much it sucks that he's leaving, and all these character arcs he's had to have about learning to appreciate what he has already done on Earth, and that he can kind of, let move on and let someone else take the reins. And that episode about how it's important that Barry realizes that Barry Allen is as important as the Flash, where in the same press conference, both the Flash and then Barry Allen are praised, and Barry Allen gets the Medal of Honor from the police department, which I thought was a little bit a little over the top, going maybe a little bit too much, and yet I also got a little misty-eyed at that scene. I also kind of liked that scene. It was, I don't know, it's odd that Joe West is up there. Like, there's one other person that we want to recognize, because it's not just people who put on costumes that, and I said we were recognizing Flash and Barry Allen. Flash is up there, but we're actually recognizing the elongated man. I forgot that that's what that press conference is. But Joe S. is like, there's one other person that we need to recognize, because it's important to note that it's not just people who wear costumes that keep saving the city. And I'm like, you should probably at some point mention the fact that you are his surrogate father, and that it kind of looks like you're just pinning a medal on your kid. But anyway, so he's got to learn that. He's got all these character arcs about mortality this season, and about retaining his optimism for the sake of his friends, and like staying strong and being the leader, and all of that is compelling enough in its way. But if he doesn't actually die, it's going to feel like a big, giant waste of time, and it's going to feel like we did a whole bunch of legwork for a thing that we really can't do later on. You get these double beats in shows like this sometimes, where, I know I go to Star Trek all the time, but I think of things like, in Voyager, there's an episode where a doppelganger version, where everyone on Voyager thinks that they're actually the real characters on Voyager, but it turns out that they're all doppelgangers, and that they're all dying. And B'Elanna and Paris get married in that episode at the beginning of it, and then it turns out that it's not actually them, because it's their it's their duplicates from the demon planet. And then in season 7, when we actually marry them off, we don't see the wedding because we did it already, except it wasn't even with our characters. So could you imagine, like, we go through all this legwork, and then Barry Allen ends up surviving, and so later on, if we ever actually want to kill him off, we'll do it in one episode. There won't be any lead up, and there'll be no talk about it or anything. Although that might be better, because then we don't know it's coming, and we can actually have a dramatic death without having to do it the comic book way and everybody talk about it, leading up to it the whole time. It's a little bit frustrating, but almost kind of fun at the same time, where like all of the irritating comic baggage has now been brought to these CW superhero shows, where we do have a convoluted mess that's very difficult to come back from, although all these shows keep trying. I think they kind of just ignore stuff that doesn't work and hope we won't notice. But it is time for a crisis. Now, I'll talk about that in a minute, because I kind of don't trust them to do what Crisis is for. This is something I've heard a lot of people talk about, and I'm wondering if we're just adapting it because it's cool, because it's a cool way to bring in a bunch of characters from other universes and do a bunch of stunt casting, and just because the people making this like Crisis and they want to put some of those moments on screen, which is cool. But are we going to do what Crisis is actually for? We need to, right? Like, it is we're in season 8 Arrow. It is really time to maybe hit the reset button and not entirely, but simplify some things a little bit. everything has been so much about the multiverse. It really is time to simplify everything down and just have one universe. And that's what Crisis was about, the original Crisis. And one of the things that was really odd a few years ago when we did Flashpoint, which was basically just there to get rid of a kiss that Barry and Iris had, their first kiss, which was really super eye-roll inducing, and that was brought up again in this last episode of Flash, and I was like, oh, don't remind me of that right before Crisis, where we have, first of all, we have Flashpoint before we have Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is really amusing to me. But also, it was kind of pointless and we didn't do anything with it. It only made, like, minor status quo changes, and by minor, I mean really minor. Like, Diggle gets a son instead of a daughter, which, by the way, I meant to talk about that in the Arrow video. I think that ends up being really funny, where Diggle has, like, such a horrible, bad run of luck with family. Like, his brother, it turns out to be a killer, and then his son in the future follows in his brother's footsteps, and also has a brother that he betrays. But would any of that have happened if Flashpoint didn't happen and he had had a daughter instead of a son? So, yeah, Flashpoint might have ruined the future. And I have a theory all of a sudden. I just thought of this. I have a theory. Is it because of Flashpoint, like, minorly screwing up little bits of the timeline that Crisis happens early? Is it possible that's the reason? Because we talk about how in this, going all the way back to first season, that the Crisis, whatever it was originally, wasn't supposed to happen in 2020 until 2024, and Barry Allen, the Flash, disappears in the Crisis, and Iris wrote that newspaper article, and everything has come to pass so far that would have been in that future. She is a journalist working for a newspaper. Her name is Iris West Allen. They did get married, and there is a crisis coming, but it's in 2019, not in 2024, and Barry Allen now inevitably has to die because he got to send his brain into the future and saw that the only permeation where everybody else survives is if he dies. And by the way, we got to see the famous Flash disintegrating panel, and it looks great. It was really cool. But I wonder if maybe it's Flashpoint that makes Crisis happen early and makes it worse for Barry. And, you know, you'd think that if you've got with the Monitor this all-knowing God, and he knows the Crisis is coming, but I guess he didn't know it years ago. Like, he's limited enough that only recently he realized it, because otherwise why didn't he work to try to stop it earlier or to try to minimize it earlier? I don't know if any of that is going to actually end up making sense. I'm not expecting it to. I'm really not. But anyway, so are we gonna actually do what we should have done with Flashpoint and merge some of these continuities finally into the same universe? Because all the multiversal stuff, as much fun as a lot of it is, especially Earth 3, with the original Flash, who, and I like that episode where we see him at the beginning of the season. Is it episode 1 or 2? Where we find out that his wife looks just like Barry's mother, and I like that we addressed that, because for whatever reason, that Jay Garrick, I guess just so that the original Flash actor from the 90s can play the original Flash. I mean, it's a cool idea, but I wish we'd started with it instead of having that actor play two different characters. Well, anyway, for a while it was like we didn't even talk about it, and now we've actually addressed it. And like, it still doesn't make any sense, really. We just say, oh, he's a doppelganger of Barry's father, even though he has a completely different name. I don't know what that's about, but I guess he's just destined to also marry someone with a different name that looks exactly like Barry's mother. It's still silly, but at least we addressed it in some way, whatever. But we do a lot of fun stuff with the multiverse, but Flashpoint would have been a clear way to get Supergirl in the same continuity. And because they want to do so much crossover with Supergirl, it was always really kind of awkward and strange that instead of doing that, we just keep coming up with ways to contrive rifts between the two universes, and it's become as easy to go between them as it is to, drive to the next city. And it's like that in the comics too, but if Supergirl had been on the CW in the first place, it probably wouldn't have been, it almost certainly wouldn't have been in another universe, unless they just decided that they never wanted to do crossovers and it was going to be its own thing so that they could have Superman in it. And I know I'm a broken record on this, but what they should have done was have it in the same universe in the first place. That's harder on a different network, I get that, but even if it wasn't in another universe, just not have Superman there in the first place and let her stand on her own and be that world's version of Superman. But since we didn't do that in the first place, and I get why we didn't, we, at least with the whole, being on another network and being in a different continuity thing, why wouldn't you use Flashpoint to merge those universes? If we don't do it now, I'm going to cry foul pretty hard. And I think that you can still continue on with some of the plot threads that some of these shows have, isolated, even if they're now all in the same universe. Particularly Batwoman, that's pretty easy. I think it's pretty easy with Legends because that kind of stands off on its own anyway, and you could have maybe a little bit of fun with, we go to some different time periods and now they look different than, like some of the same time periods we've been to, now they look a little bit different than they have before because we merged everything. And I think we could have a lot of fun with certain characters having to reacclimate being now in a world that doesn't look like the one that they used to be in because they all got merged. And you've got Aftermath like that with Crisis. That's what the end of Crisis is about. And I really hope we do that. I don't trust it. I don't think that's going to happen. But there's been so much build-up. We've made such a big deal out of this that I really hope that there are actually long-lasting effects and it's not just lame, easy stuff like, oh, our main characters didn't have their first kiss. The word crisis has to be thrown in every episode at least 19 times in order to, I think, advertise that this big event is coming. We just say it over and over and over again. And every time somebody says it, I just want to put like a registered trademark in a word balloon right above their head. This is very comic book. I don't guess I mind too much that and Arrow it has this as well, of course, that there's a name for it and that it's the same thing that we're calling it. They say, oh wait, Crisis is coming. And then we've even said Infinite Earths a few times. But it's just so often. It's over and over again. It's like, this is just the official word for this, and we've got a quota. We've got to just make sure we say it as often as humanly possible. Other plot threads and things to talk about. There are characters this season that have been in the show for a while, apparently, that I'm not familiar with. So, again, was a little lost at the beginning of the season and had to play catch-up a little bit. And some of this stuff is building on things I didn't watch, so I might have a different viewpoint on some of it than if I watch that stuff than I do right now. The Elongated Man, Ralph, I like him. And he's a lot of fun. The stretching effect looks as good as it's going to on television. There's several episodes at the beginning where I kept wondering when we were gonna see him do more of his stretchy powers. He did it one time and I was like, oh cool, that's Plastic Man or the Elongated. Found out later he was the Elongated Man, and I was like, oh that's pretty cool. But I was bummed out because it was like they just don't have the budget to do this effect very often. And then he's got a big showdown with Ramsey later that looks pretty good, again, for television. I was like, that's cool. Some nice action this season. Usually the action in the show is not quite as good as it is in Arrow. I think this season it absolutely is in a lot of places. I think the coolest fight scene in this season is in the 007 ripoff episode, which is not great, but it's fun. It's such a cartoon. It's just because your characters keep talking about how much cliche Bond stuff there is in the episode doesn't give you an out to be able to be that cliche with it. It just felt so unbelievable and unrealistic. There's a scene where the bad guy, Ralph has gone down all the ways in which this bad guy is a Bond villain. And then they go all the way to, do you expect me to talk? No, Mr. Dibney, I expect you to die. And he says, oh, come on, that's right out of that movie. I'm like, yeah, but you started it, dude. And then like immediately after that, he says that something is like right out of Goldfinger or something, and the bad guy goes, "No, but this is," and he pulls out like a big ray gun, and it's a cartoon. But it was kind of entertaining. I enjoyed a lot of things about that episode. I think that Ralph was an idiot for bringing Barry with him. That whole episode, Barry had to like learn finesse, like the Tick says in the Amazon show, the art of finesse. And I don't think he ever really quite learns that lesson, because, well, okay, he sort of does. He discovers that he plays drunk really well, even though he can't get drunk. And anyway, so, toward the end of that episode, Barry's kind of screwed them because he jumped the gun and got in his flash suit earlier than he should have, and they needed to keep playing undercover agents longer, even though he was also a total liability and kept messing up the plan when he was, in his civilian clothes, in a suit. And later on, Ralph goes, I didn't need the Flash, I really needed Barry. I was like, no, you didn't, though. Because when you had Barry, he was awful, and he just kept ruining everything. But anyway, I brought up that episode to say that there's a really fun fight right at the end of that I like a lot. And then when there's some hit and miss humor this season, particularly with pop culture references. I mean, like, the Star Wars references has really gotten out of hand. But there's this one bit where he goes up to Ultraviolet, and he's pretending to be drunk, and he's in his civilian clothes, and he says, I really like Mortal Kombat. That was really funny, because she looks like Scorpion. And then he goes, you know what my favorite part of Mortal Kombat is? And he's like, finish him. And like that was pretty funny. I enjoyed that immensely. But yeah, so a lot of fun stuff all over the season, just really varied. But anyway, the problem with a character like Ralph is, and this happens a lot, he's there initially to be a fun new character, to kind of be comic relief, to remind us that this is supposed to be a fun and optimistic show, versus its broodier, heavier counterpart with Arrow. And then, in order for him not to just be the butt of jokes all the time, he's got to, we try to balance it so that he also has a dramatic subplot. And it just makes him feel kind of pathetic. I'm not saying that he shouldn't have some kind of a dramatic subplot anywhere. I'm just saying that stuff doesn't tend to be handled well when it's as shoehorned in as it is here. And that happens with him and his girlfriend or his wife, and it's not great. But I do like the whole thing about Flash kind of passing the torch to him to save the city. So like Cisco's supposed to be in charge of the team, but he's supposed to kind of be the new symbol of heroism for the city, and I like that. That works fine. The whole thing with Caitlin and Killer Frost, I've never liked. So I had a hard time getting into that subplot, and we spent too much time on it. I got kind of bored of it, where Killer Frost wants to have a real life, and so Caitlin kindly allows her to take over her body more often through the season. And after the first couple episodes, it's Killer Frost in her body like all the time. Which, first of all, I don't really get. I would think that if both of you want to live a life where you have this multiple personality thing, and it's like very literally another person actually in you, wouldn't you like decide split the hours off and just say like, okay, you get to have the body from this time to this time of day, and then I get the body this time to this time of day, or maybe go like every other day. Okay, you get it Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I get it like, I don't know why they don't do that. It's like just this season they wanted they wanted that actress, I forget her name right now, to play Killer Frost more often than Caitlin. Like, that's the character we're really going to focus on, so Caitlin's got to be taken out for a long time. I don't feel like Caitlin would be okay with that any more than Killer Frost was, with how often she didn't get to be in charge. Like, it's only fair to go 50-50 if you trust Killer Frost to not go murder people, and if you care about her and you're actually going to let her go live a life. So I think that's kind of odd. I think that she does a really good job of acting those two roles very differently, so it's nothing against the actress. I just have never cared for that idea. Like, that's the way we did Killer Frost, was to make it another personality, and compounded by the fact that because we didn't want to make Caitlin go dark, this always felt like a very don't kill your darlings thing, or like we were afraid to kill our darlings thing, where it's like, well, she's supposed to be Killer Frost, so like either do that or don't do that. And they kind of had their cake and eat it too already, because they had a Killer Frost from another universe, and that's how we first saw her. So we did that, but we still feel like we have to have an actual Killer Frost in our universe, so she's going to have a doppelganger that's in her body already, and I've never liked that idea, and so, you know, we didn't drop it, so I don't love it. But she's not unlikable, and we do some fun things with her, you know, trying to live her own personal life and stuff, and it's fine. I just, you know, can't get excited about it. There's some silly leaps in logic here and there, as you often have with these shows. There's one bit that I thought was really perplexing, where before he realizes that Barry Allen is the Flash, Ramsey, so Barry goes to Ramsey and thinks he has a cure for the HLH, and it would have worked if Ramsey didn't already monkey with his own membranes a whole bunch, and now it's not going to work on him because he's messed up his body chemistry so much. And Ramsey is floored that Barry would give him the cure instead of using it on himself. And I don't understand that at all, because Ramsey doesn't know what's wrong with him. Like, he knows that Barry is supposed to die and thinks he has a debilitating illness, but it's not a cure-all drug. He's just told, if memory serves, by Barry that it can cure his HLH. So why is he like, well, you're also dying. Why don't you take this cure? Maybe because it's not a cure for what he's dying of, right? I don't know, that was really weird. Oh, I should mention, by the way, that this is the best Flash's costume has ever looked. I saw somebody in the comments the other day say it's right off the page. I absolutely agree with that. It's awesome. I wish it's what we had started with. And I don't hate that suit from the beginning, but as time has gone on, we've gotten farther and farther away from trying to look as realistic as possible in these shows, and no longer do we care about armor and about padding as much, and now we just do kind of straight up superhero costumes, and it's great. I mean, at the same time, we've also gotten a little bit less, maybe a lot less sophisticated in our storytelling, and because we're doing comic book shows, we think that we can get away with a lot more, again, leaps in logic and things that just don't make sense and inconsistent stuff. So that's an unfortunate trade-off, but man, I like what the show looks like right now, and especially Flash's costume. I guess I should mention Nash Wells, yet another Wells. It's kind of a running gag the show has, where we just do not want to lose that actor, and he's great, but I want to see him in other stuff, because he's too good for the show. And in this, he is he's a traveler from another dimension who he's an interdimensional adventurer, and he's trying to get his hands on a substance that I guess is supposed to kill the Monitor, or at least that's what we're led to believe. At the end of this last episode, I'm not totally sure what exactly he's trying to do with the Monitor, but he keeps calling him a false god, and we have kind of the same thing we do in Arrow, where there's this big question as to how much we can trust the Monitor and what exactly his motivations are. And in Arrow, it seems like Oliver ends up being in the wrong for thinking about that, or for thinking that about the Monitor, and ultimately he's more altruistic than we thought, and he's actually doing things for the right reasons. Here, all the way up to episode 8, we're still led to wonder whether or not the Monitor is going to end up being the bad guy, and I was kind of surprised by that. I thought both shows would get to the same place. So if you watch both shows, once you get into Crisis, you're going to be wondering where the Monitor's loyalties lie and why exactly he's been manipulating all these different people to do different things. And I hope that stuff pays off, but again, I really don't expect all those threads to ultimately really tie together and be cohesive, but I'll be really super impressed if we stick that landing. But he acts in this, especially with Wells, as a lot more like an actual god. He's basically telling Wells that he needs to defer to him and worship him. And it's kind of interesting, and I guess, you know, we'll see where all that goes. And Wells gets sucked into a wall at the end, a la like the cave wall in Smallville, and I'm sure he's going to be some kind of like acolyte for the Monitor or something. Obviously, the first episode of Crisis, again, has already dropped, so I don't know how useful this is going to be for anybody in determining how much of this stuff you want to watch before Crisis, because it's already started. But if you're waiting to watch Crisis until it's all together and you have time to binge these shows, I'm going to go against some people that gave me advice before I started watching Arrow, and I'm going to say watch all 8 of these, because I heard a lot of people say, well, Arrow was really important leading up to Crisis, but Flash, you only need the first couple episodes and the rest of it is filler. I don't really know what folks are talking about. I don't think the first 2 episodes are any more or less about Crisis than most of the rest of this. Like, there's a couple episodes in the middle that aren't as much about that, but they still are in the sense that Barry is dealing with like getting his affairs in order for the future. But I guess that was said before the last couple episodes were dropped, because those are a lot more, again, about leading up to Crisis, particularly with Wells trying to find the Monitor and everything. So I don't know, I think both shows are equally prologues leading up to Crisis, and I've been told that the other shows don't do too much with it at all, but I think they occasionally mention it here and there. And going into Crisis, these will be the only things I really know, so I'm not familiar with the current status quos for Legends or Supergirl. Batwoman I've seen the first 3 episodes of. I haven't continued watching that show, but I don't suspect that the characters in that show beyond her are really going to factor in too much there. I do expect some Supergirl stuff to probably matter, because I know Lex Luthor is involved, and I've never seen their Lex, which is kind of unfortunate. I've heard he's great, but I just haven't gone back and looked at that show in a good long time. So there are some blind spots that I'm going to have, but I'm glad that I've watched these 2 shows, partly because I'm not going to be completely lost going into Crisis, but also because I actually really enjoyed them and found them really entertaining, and it's been a lot of fun leaping back into this universe, even though I think there's a lot of stuff both shows did that you can't ever fully come back from. If I sat down and watched all of them at once and did an analysis on them, I'm sure I would find all kinds of stuff that doesn't work now because of things that contradict it from before, or things that just don't make sense to come back from. But watching it more in a vacuum, getting some time away from it, not bothering with the last couple seasons, watching this more as just a piece on its own and as part of what will become Crisis, I've really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun, so I'm certainly feeling it. If you've been watching Flash, leave your comments, let me know what you think about it. Sorry I wasn't able to get this up before Crisis started, but I got really close, so hopefully this is still informative and enjoyable for you guys, especially folks that have been following the show, and looking forward to seeing what your opinions are of where we've come so far. And like I said, I will be doing 2 videos on Crisis as it goes forward, and if you enjoyed this, I might consider looking at some of the other superhero shows that are on that I've not been talking about in a while, maybe, not because they lead to Crisis, but just because it might be interesting to check in with them. And since I did this with these 2 shows and didn't watch everything before it, I don't know, I might go back and look at some of the earlier seasons that I didn't look at until my brain turns to mush and talk about them, or I might just jump in the middle and see what's going on and weigh in on it a little bit. I'm not sure yet. I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants, but I hope you had a good time here. I certainly did, and I'll see you again next time. I'm Captain Logan, and thanks for watching.